Hi everyone, welcome to our second Australian Water Safety Council Water Safety Strategy webinar series. We've got a fantastic lineup today, an expanded lineup actually. We've been advertising some wonderful speakers including Shane Dorr, Amy Peden, John Lippmann, but in the last 48 hours or so we've been scrambling as a team to put together some additional speakers that I think will make this session greatly improved from the last session, which feedback was very positive about. So thank you very much for joining us. I see there's about 50 people that have joined so far. If you've got a friend that hasn't logged in yet and might be missing out, send them a text, direct them to the Royal Lifesaving website. There's a link there where they can access this webinar as well. With that, we will get started. Today's session is focused on two things. It's focused on places and activities, and this is a sort of a key part of the wheel, the pinwheel, some people are calling it, of the Australian Water Safety Strategy. And this is the way that we've divided up the strategy into areas of focus. Last week we talked about people and populations, and today we're going to very much focus on places and activities. And of course, along the way, we'll talk about the people and populations and how they intersect with these places and activities. This session will involve a range of speakers zooming in and out, and we're so hoping that the technology works quite nicely as we find our way through. I would encourage you to use the chat, but also use the Q&A. If you've got a question, log it into the Q&A. We'll be monitoring it very, very closely in order to make sure that we can engage you in this discussion. Use the chat as much as you need. If you need to drop some links into different areas of activity and work in the chat, then that works really well as well, to kind of keep you focused on the webinar and engaging with all of your colleagues from across the country and a few colleagues from international as well. So at this point, I'd really like to introduce our first panel speakers. Firstly, I'd like to introduce Shane Dorr, ESM. He's the General Manager of Coastal Safety with Surf Lifesaving Australia. Welcome, Shane.
Thanks, Justin, and great to have so many people attending today.
Fantastic. And of course, Dr. Amy Peden, lecturer at University of New South Wales. Welcome, Dr. Peden.
Hi, thank you.
All right, very good. So you both have great expertise, but Shane, maybe for those that aren't familiar with you from your many, many media appearances across summer and speaking at conferences, can you introduce yourself and what you work on and what makes you tick?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Justin. So Shane Dorr, I'm the General Manager Coastal Safety for Surf Lifesaving Australia. Also the General Manager for the Westpac Lifesaver Rescue Helicopter here in Sydney, for the Sydney Basin and for Maria on the South Coast. The primary role is with Surf Lifesaving Australia as a General Manager, looks at the strategy and the functions around drowning prevention, water safety, and the life-saving functions from our 314 clubs around the country to our inflatable rescue boats, the services that we deliver, the type of equipment, but also they're looking at the drowning research, working with my researcher that I have, Jazz Laws, who you had on last week, and the team that we've got here to look at the coastal drowning fatalities and what those impacts are and what we need to be thinking about from a surf lifesaving organisation to reducing those and reducing loss of life and injury in and around that environment.
Great, thanks, Shane. I look forward to talking about the beach part of the strategy, but we'll go to Amy. Amy, when you're not researching, I assume you're researching.
Pretty much, yeah. I don't have much of a life. Children and research, pretty much. Yes, I'm a lecturer at UNSW Sydney, working on injury prevention, so still very much working on drowning. It's a topic very close to my heart, but also working in the teaching space, running an injury prevention course and also health promotion courses. And yes, really keen to talk today about rivers. It's been my passion, did a PhD on it, but also what we can learn from the beach environment and the rivers work and vice versa to kind of progress the goals and the ambitious goals of the strategy, so we really can continue to bring those number of drowning deaths down. So really looking forward to talking about it today.
Great. Well, together you've really got a great skill set and insights to talk about places with some depth. But Shane, let's start with you. The key area of the strategy here for places is divided into beaches, ocean and rocks. Let's talk a little bit about the recommendations there. One of the things that piques my interest is this is a little bit more than drowning. You're actually encouraging us to look more closely at other injuries in the coastal environment.
Yeah, 100% correct. Yeah, what we've been looking at is it's not just the drowning, it's other type of fatalities and also injury, which can be short-term and long-term. But we know with the work that we've been doing recently that, you know, whilst we've been focusing on drowning for a long time and working with yourself and people like Amy and Alison, etc., what we're finding is that it's far more reaching, and as in particular as first responders, we don't know whether we're attending a drowning incident or, you know, whether it's some other a medical episode, an accident, whatever it may be. We're attending to someone in distress in some or, you know, in drastic need of attention. So from that perspective, we need to understand that to see whether or not we have the same causal factors which are attributed to drowning, or whether there's other contributory elements there. So we're looking at what that may mean to us for a member welfare aspect as part of it. So how do we take care of our members and make sure they're either equipped to deal with the situation or have the right equipment to actually respond to those situations and also manage it afterwards. So, you know, whether that's ranging from motorboat accidents to self-harm, whatever it may be, we're finding that, you know, for example, last year we know that we had 125 coastal drowning deaths, but on top of that, we had another 110 other type of coastal fatalities. And that's from marine stingers to sharks, through to self-harm, to accidents, etc. So there's a great diversity, and that exposure impacts far more broadly than just the drowning, which is still a priority and the number one priority for us. But then we're also looking at those other longer-term injuries with spinal incidents and other injuries which have far-reaching impacts through to, you know, friends, family, loved ones, the community. So from our perspective, it's, you know, what are all the issues that we're facing? How do we reduce that? Because they, you know, whilst drowning is vitally important, there's some other domino effects that go on with some of these instances as well.
Right, and I think we should acknowledge that it was First Responders Day yesterday, and so your organisation and many others, marine rescue, combined to provide a really great service across the coastline. Can you talk a little bit about the elements of the strategy that talk about technology and innovation in terms of those frontline services and those first responders?
Yeah, most definitely. I guess probably one of the key things that we've been looking at, and it's a bit of chicken and egg, is, you know, what data can we collect and how do we collect that? So part of our technology is looking at smarter systems to make it more efficient for collecting the data. So for the number of rescues that are occurring, where they're occurring, the type of incident that it relates to, who the people are, what's the demographic and age and nationality of these people at these locations. So looking at smarter tools to make it easier for our members to record that data, which will help inform us and others so that we may be able to look at other prevention strategies around that for the future. Technology-wise, also we're looking at how do we respond. So there's been a lot of work done, in particular out of Victoria and Queensland, and more recently in New South Wales with alert systems, so emergency beacons and camera systems, so that we can monitor more locations in remote areas, but also busy areas where we may not always have the eyes there, so we can monitor them, and looking at systems where if something does start to occur, that we can respond to them in an efficient and timely manner. And then that's gone through to where we've been working with drones and looking at them for prevention type activities, for search and rescue type activities, and just for general surveillance. So it gives that extra set of eyes, a three-dimensional picture, so to speak, from the air, where it'll paint a bit of a picture for surf lifesavers and lifeguards, so they can have a greater awareness of what's happening around them and hopefully prevent incidents from occurring in the first place. And that goes right through to, you know, with looking at new technology around our rescue devices, whether it's helicopters, jet boats, inflatable rescue boats, to other communications, and smart tools for reducing risk. So we've been doing a lot of work around surf risk rating apps to try and firstly internally, so how we can use that to actually identify a risk and therefore have some clear understanding of what we can do to mitigate that. But we want to turn that into a bit more of a public-facing tool as well. So remember, the public can see can go there and do a very simple risk assessment using this tool, and that'll inform them that, you know, maybe they should be swimming at a patrolled beach or other considerations that they should be making, so that they can make an informed decision about recreating at those locations.
Great, thanks Shane. Amy, you've been doing a little bit more coastal research lately than you previously did. So tell us a little bit about that research, but from the perspective of how it might inform approaches to prevention.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my heart is still with rivers, but it's been nice to collaborate a bit more with surf lifesaving in this role and conduct some research alongside surf lifesaving. I think, yeah, it's been really interesting to look at some emerging issues. The points that Shane made about the data collection challenge are really interesting. And I think it's quite, you know, to think about rivers as well. If surf lifesaving and those coastal environments are having challenges with data collection, then that's going to magnify those issues for our inland environments where we don't have a you know, a designated team looking at safety and looking at how we can collect that data from the community. I think is going to be really important in the river space as well. But it's been really great to collaborate on that research and look at where we can share lessons, I guess, both from a data perspective and some of the work Royal Lifesaving has done to build an amazing database, but also, I guess, think about the lessons we can share between environments and learn from each other.
Thank you. I'm just watching the chat and there's not a lot of activity. There are 84 people now on the webinar, which is pretty fantastic. But the Royal Lifesaving team are busy on Teams and they're exchanging shortbread recipes. I'm not quite sure what that's all about. But I have been reminded that I didn't acknowledge the traditional owners on which this webinar is taking place. So I should acknowledge the Camaragal people, which are the traditional owners of the land on which I live here. So I acknowledge their elders past, present, and emerging. But what I'd like to do is actually just show one of the SLSA campaigns in this area. And while that's happening, we're going to bring another speaker in and we'll surprise you with that person. So let's go to the video.
So you think you know about rip currents? Myth. Only tourists get caught in rips. Myth. Experienced swimmers can always spot a rip. Myth. Rips only take the lives of poor swimmers. Fact. It's young men who are most likely to die in rip. Risk the rip. Visit beachsafe.org.au to find out what you don't know about rips.
Fantastic. And of course, it would be an incomplete discussion about rips without having Dr. Rip himself. So I'd like to welcome Professor Rob Brander to the conversation.
Thanks, Justin.
You have the best virtual backdrop in the entire sort of world of drowning prevention and lifesaving, I must say.
Yeah, it's a unique insight into my man cave, actually, which is also my garage, which is about 7 degrees Celsius at the moment. So.
Oh. So let's talk about that man cave, but in the context of men and the problem of men and rips and rip communication. And so what's, you know, this myth campaign, which I think was a very strong campaign launched a few years ago, delivered, I guess, a couple of very strong messages to men.
Yeah, I mean, that campaign, the young men was one aspect of it. There was a number of very good videos. But of course, young men, you know, they drown in rips just like they drown in other coastal environments and other inland waterways because they're the risk takers. But I guess the question is, when they see something like that, does it make an impact? And I think in terms of rip current education or any sort of drowning education, when we put these materials out there on social media or whatever, they're fantastic. But we really need to know, what are people taking away from those videos? And what are they remembering? And is it actually impacting their behavior?
Yeah, and Shane, you were, I imagine you were very much behind the design of the campaign. How did that campaign work from your perspective, and what were the key messages?
Yeah, it was critical to us when we commenced this campaign. It originally came about with, we're looking at what's our new campaign and where we were going, and we had a bit of a look at it, you know, and it was focused on swimming between the flags. Which has been an adage which we still promote today, but it was something that we were putting in. It was a bit probably warm and fuzzy at the time, as we had done with a couple of campaigns. Whilst they met our brief, they probably didn't address the issues that Rob has referred to as well. So with this, one of the key things that we did is we had a look at some of the data. We did a fair bit of research. We worked with Omnipol, Ipsos, looking at different things. And the research came back showing us that, a large proportion of the public, over 86%, said that they know that they're meant to swim at the beach between the flags, but they don't do it because it doesn't apply to them, because they know how to spot rip currents and that it's tourists that get in trouble. And so we had a bit of a change in our direction and said, right, for the rip current campaign, we came up with a 5-year strategy, and it was having a couple of years, and this was with the experts telling us about behavioural change, and it was a couple of years of actually myth busting, breaking down the truth and challenging people, not giving them the answers directly, but giving them a bit of a challenge to make them think and make them own some of their decision making and finding out that information for themselves, providing them links and directions to that. And then for the last 3 years, then about challenging behaviour. So the Rip Current campaign, it's in its 5th year now. So yeah, the first 2 years was about myth busting, and that's what you just showed then. And then we had the last 3 years about change of behaviour. So the key focus for us was to challenge people to get them to own it. And I think it's like anything. If you told someone it's wet paint, most people want to go up there and test that for themselves. And so what we found is, and Rob was involved in something we did probably, Rob, 8 to 10 years, 12 years ago, where we had a Rip Current symposium or forum with people, and we had so many people coming in telling us that rips only ever recirculate. And what we do know is there's 17,000 rips on any given day in Australia, that they're unpredictable. And Rob led a lot of that research. And so what we wanted to get to people is that, what people believe to be the truth may not be the truth. And myth busting was the first step to that. Because what we noticed is that, a large proportion of the population said that they could actually identify rip currents. But what we found is 2 out of 3 that said they could identify a rip current correctly actually got it wrong. So, only 1/3 was actually getting it right. So we've created a bit of a monster for ourselves, that we've been putting out a lot of information about rip currents, and being Australian, that we all know, we all go to the beach, therefore we know what we're doing. Whereas the fact is that rip currents are very hard to identify. And so that was a challenging perspective for us. So the rip current was very focused on the behavioural change, but people owning that decision. So experience can't always be given, but we needed to take people, rather than telling them, challenge them so that they would look into it further and identify that information, and therefore hopefully own that moving forward.
Thanks, Shane. Rob, I do think even over summer we have this tremendous debate, largely played out in the media and with multiple voices. Julie Power did an article on this, I think, just in February. And the question is, float, parallel. We just seem to continue, as hard as you and Shane work out, we just seem to send multiple messages still out to the community. Where is that going to land, and who are we talking to, and what messages do we need to deliver?
Well, that's a good question, because as Shane mentioned, rips are so unpredictable. There's different types of rips. They behave differently. Some recirculate, some go out, and we've done actual experiments of putting people in rips and testing these escape strategies, and there's not one single escape strategy that will always work. So it's difficult to give a single message about what to do when you get stuck in a rip. I can't promote floating over swimming out of a rip, because they don't always work. Sometimes they do. So it's a problem. I mean, with rip currents, there's awareness. People need to be aware that they exist. They need to have some sort of basic understanding of what they are. It would be nice if we could train people to be able to spot rips, but of course, different types of rips exist that look different. There's all sorts of different visual signatures. And it's easy to show pictures of pretty obvious rips to people and say, this is what a rip looks like. But when you put them on the beach, that doesn't always translate, because the surf zone looks often chaotic to most people. And Shane mentioned that stat, that many people who think they know they can spot a rip actually can't when they are shown photographs. But the situation is actually worse than that, because there's been some research come out of New Zealand, and we've just done some at unpatrolled beaches in New South Wales, where we actually have people on the beach. We show them 3 or 4 pictures of rips and say, can you spot the rip? And some of them get them all right. And then we say, well, look, there's rips on this beach. Can you actually spot them? And they can't. So rip education is tricky, but I think there has to be first some basic awareness that if you are swimming outside of the flags, or on a unpatrolled beach, on a surf beach, there's a strong likelihood that there are these rip currents that are actually pretty serious and cause a lot of drownings. Because you want people to avoid making bad decisions about where they're going to swim. Having said that, invariably people will still get in trouble in rip currents. So we have to tell them something. And that's where it becomes complicated. So the other factor that's very hard to get a handle on is even experienced swimmers, when they get caught in a rip current, they invariably get panicky and they start to get exhausted. And a lot of that good advice that they may have remembered sometimes goes out the window.
Amy, you did some research, probably with Richard Franklin and perhaps with Jazz Laws and Shane, just about this notion of rescuers getting into trouble. Barob's someone on the chat's just mentioned that issue of there's the chat and questions are really about strategies well outside of the flags, but there's also this notion of rescuers themselves getting into trouble. Can you comment on this issue that you've been researching?
Yeah, it's so tragic. I mean, we try and convey common sense and talk about risk to rescuers, and that if you're untrained, the risk is quite high that something could go wrong. But at the same time, it's human instinct to want to help someone. And the research that we've done has shown that it's often a child or a family member, a loved one, a friend that you'll be going to the aid of. And so I can completely understand why, common sense would go out the window and you just try and help people. So I think it's about, ideally everybody has those rescue skills and has done a bronze medallion and knows what to do, has learnt CPR as well. But I guess if that's not going to be realistic, it's talking about how to, stop and have a think, call for help. If there's a talk or a reach rescue, a way that you can, enact a rescue without getting in, or taking flotation devices with you. But ultimately, if we're talking about the coastal environment, really primarily encouraging people to swim between the flags so that there is someone there to help you should something go wrong. And I guess at our rivers and when we get onto our inland environments, it's really about people having those skills to help should something go wrong. But yeah, it is a really challenging one because, as we know, it's a child, a loved one, and common sense really will go out the window in these high stress situations. So if we can be putting people in safer positions with the skills to help, maybe we can see those kind of statistics come down.
Yeah, I might just add something to that because the bystander issue is becoming increasingly more of an issue. And we've done a lot of work with Shane and Jazz at Surf Life Saving. One, establishing the scope of the problem, but two, actually talking to people who've been involved in bystander rescues. And what's really coming out of all of the research is people aren't using flotation devices. And as Amy says, people are going to rush in. If it's your child or somebody you're probably not going to think too much about it and just go in. But what we're trying to find is really what are the simple messages that we can get out there that will resonate with people. And it might be something as simple as don't rush in, take 10 seconds to get somebody to get help, look for a flotation device. But this also relates back to, Shane didn't mention it, but part of the surf rip current campaign was this think line approach, where you go to the beach and you stop, look, plan. So you stop and you look at the situation, you think about if there's any hazards, where you might get into trouble. And if somebody does get into trouble, you have a plan. And that might just be, where's the nearest boogie board that I can grab to go in? And I think that think line approach is simple. And I think that's something that we should really, really keep pushing.
And on that, on that, Justin, and 100% correct there, Rob. On that Think Line campaign, all the people that are in and I don't know whether everyone's seen the Think Line advertisement. I know you showed it in your session last week, but the Think Line has all those people have been caught in a rip at some stage, have had family members in there. So the last person that we have on there is Derek Wilson, who lost 2 of his own children and 2 of his nieces who went to rescue those children in a very sad and tragic event down at Gunnamatta. So 4 young lives lost in one tragic incident as a result of a rip current. And, when we got these people engaged, that's what it was about. It's, and we're talking to them, and there was a question here, which Richard said about, did we engage young males, etc., who are part of this demographic? We engaged a lot of young people to see what would be the mechanism to get there. And it was about not telling them what to do, but giving them prompts about how to be staying safe. And that's where we came up with, okay, stop, look, plan. So we're not saying you can't go in the water, but what we're asking you to do is stop and consider what are what are the risks where you're going. Do you know if it's dangerous? Do you not know whether it's dangerous? Look around. Is there a patrol beach nearby? Can you see some other potential hazards? Can you look for the rip current and plan? And one of the things we've done there is we've developed the website beachsafe.org.au, which is also available on an app, which shows the approximately 12,000 beaches around Australia, and just gives you some hazard ratings, some safety information, and locations to other areas where it may be safer to swim. So a critical factor for us is about providing that awareness and that information so people can be better informed for when they are going to be heading to these coastal locations. Because as Rob mentioned, one of the key things that we did with the Stop Look plan is there's no red and yellow in it. It's not about surf lifesaving. It's about the community. And we've got 314 surf lifesaving clubs around Australia. There's nearly 12,000 beaches. We patrol around about 500 beaches, but we're a vast coastline, 52,000 kilometres of coastline, including all our islands. So we can't be everywhere all the time. So we need to be looking at how we empower people to actually own some of the water safety behaviour themselves.
Yeah, I've been watching eagerly on social media, Rob. And some days, particularly on a Sunday, I wish I was a coastal scientist, because it seems like your students have more fun than even Professor Short's students used to have when they mapped all of those beaches that Shane was referring to. Is it ethical to put a PhD student in a RIP, or is it all in the name of science?
Is it ethical?
I'm joking.
You should ask Will Kuhn that question, because I threw him in a RIP at Duranbah about 2 weeks ago.
All in the name of science.
He is a trained lifeguard. Yeah.
Yeah. So what are you finding when you're going to Shane's mentioned the many non-patrolled locations, and Australians love getting away from it. There's nothing better than being on a beach with very few people and enjoying the surf or time with friends. So what are you finding when you're going to these sort of high-risk locations without patrolling services?
Well, this is the elephant in the room. I mean, for so long we've propped ourselves up and we've reinforced the swim between the red and yellow flags message, and as we should. But the reality is that there's so many beaches that are unpatrolled, that probably won't be patrolled, and they're very popular tourist destinations. You've got coastal tourist parks situated on those beaches, and it's unrealistic to think that those people who've paid that money to stay at that beach are going to jump in a car and drive 25 kilometers to the nearest flag beach. It's just not going to happen. So in that situation, we have to give them something. And that's where this think line approach and Shane's approach to just putting the behavior on the onus of the people is key. And we have to somehow ingrain messages into people's psyche that, look, if you're not on a patrol beach, you've got to have a backup plan. You've got to think pretty hard about whether it's safe to swim or not. And that is going to be the ongoing challenge, because people are not always going to swim between the flags for a whole bunch of reasons. And our research is finding that we surveyed over 400 people at unpatrolled beaches in the last summer season. We were asking them, why are you swimming here? And a whole bunch of reasons. One, it's close to their accommodation. It's their favorite beach. They want to get away from people. They like the quiet of it. And invariably, if you're going to go to a beach, probably you're going to go for a swim.
With that, Rob, I'd like to thank you for joining the webinar. I think it's been a really great surprise contribution for everyone. And we're going to move on and just talk very quickly about rocks and then get to Amy's favourite topic, rivers. So thanks, Rob. Have a great day.
Thanks, Justin.
Thank you. All right. So we've got a short video. We're going to talk about rocks in a moment, because I think that Rob was sort of overlapping with these other locations. So there's a video that we're going to play just quickly.
We know that they'd been on rocks at Bushrangers Bay. They were hit by a big wave and washed into the surf. The life-saving Victoria helicopter, the police air wing, the air ambulance all responded to this situation. They were able to rescue 5 people, but 1 person has drowned. This is a beach which is not patrolled by surf lifesavers. It's renowned for big surf and strong rips. This is in fact the 2nd helicopter rescue at this location in less than a week. Unfortunately, on this occasion, 1 person could not be saved. 5 others are now in hospital.
So obviously we can't talk about the circumstances of this particular, it's more just an example. And Shane, I know we had over summer a number of examples, very visible examples, tragic examples where people were swept from rocks. They didn't intend to be in the water. They were there for other reasons. So what do we need to do in this area?
Yeah, thanks, Justin. Yes, for summer, it was a very tragic time for many. We had our second highest number of drowning deaths over the summer period in the coastal environment in the last 10 years. So, that's quite dramatic. And rock fishing was very prevalent in that, with a couple of multiple tragedy incidents which occurred, not just in New South Wales, but we had them in Victoria, WA. So they're happening around the country. But yeah, some of the big ones happened here in New South Wales with the multiple tragedies. What do we need to be doing? Very simply, we need to be working with the various communities, with the councils, the government, to put in place practices which are going to ensure the safety and well-being of just not those people participating in the activity, but those that may be called upon to go and assist them. And we know that happens far too often, in that sense, where we've had police, we've had surf lifesavers, off-duty police and lifeguards, etc., all responding to different situations and members of the community and putting their lives at risk. So with the life jackets, we know that through the great work that's been done previously with Randwick Council doing the trial on the life jackets, we know that it's been effective in many respects. Other councils, it's voluntary for them to sign up to it. So the life jackets is one part of it. I know that there's been also some work done around talking to rock fishers, and we've done a lot of research. We've worked with the University of Melbourne and Campster, etc., where we've been talking about those behaviours, and what we're finding is that it's generally the inexperienced people unfamiliar with those areas, which have been getting into trouble. But it's also breaking down that barrier and the stereotype that wearing a life jacket means that I'm not tough and all this sort of stuff. So it's challenging those behaviours.
We're going to get to rock fishing a little bit later so this is one of the challenges in designing a strategy, right? So it's this overlap between activities and places. And so there's a whole session on rock fishing. Yep. So hold your thoughts there, Shane. I do think it overlaps quite significantly, but outside of rock fishing, we've got this issue of people, and I think the headlines over summer were the selfie. They were going to a particular mermaid pools, those sorts of places where it's Instagrammable. Amy, what do we need to do to get the messages out to those sort of, that cohort of people?
Yeah, it's an increasing issue, I guess, a modern phenomenon that we're facing. And we did see that research come out globally, I think, that found that drowning was the leading cause of death due to in selfie-related incidents. So I guess certain people are taking risks to get the shot for Facebook and for social media. We have these kind of picturesque but pretty isolated and risky locations being popularized on social media with hashtags and things like that. I think we've got to think about how we can get warnings out to people who might be intending to go to this location for one reason, and as you said before, Justin, never even intending to get in the water. So it's about those warnings. I know, Figure 8 Pools is a location that I believe National Parks closed at times to try and keep people out. We've got the option of signage, but signage is not particularly effective necessarily. People may not really read it or take notice of it. So I think it really is quite a modern challenge, and as we've said everywhere at every time, it really is back to people making better decisions. So if we can talk about the risk and really make people think about whether it's worth a great shot and a couple of likes on Instagram, whether that's worth risking your life.
I think that mention of national parks gives me an opportunity to move to the next topic, which is rivers and lakes. So you're off the hook a little bit, Shane, but we'll bring you in just a moment. Amy, you released some research just recently that looked at lakes and rivers, and it mentioned the notion of owners of water and getting those groups involved in prevention. So do you want to just talk about what the strategy is recommending in this area, and a little bit about your research and background and from a preventative perspective?
Yeah, so we've obviously done quite a lot of work at Royal Lifesaving and with Richard Franklin and Peter Leggett at James Cook University about rivers. But I guess that broader category of inland waterways includes our lakes and dams. And while there's been a little bit of attention on farm dams, although not too much recently, we really haven't looked at lakes much. And I guess there are more controlled environment in the sense that they may not be, well, some can be quite large, but rivers are particularly complicated with ownership and different owners on different banks, and the water versus the river bed versus the edge, you know, it can be quite complicated. With lakes, we felt that maybe that was going to be a little bit more manageable. So the research we did went and had a look at some of the land authorities or the owners of these waterways, and to go and have a look in particular at the information, if any had a water safety management plan or any available information that might include drowning prevention as opposed to other factors that weren't really relevant to drowning prevention. And we found that there wasn't a lot of that information in these plans, but there's pretty clear ownership of these environments. Some national parks, some private industry, some council or government owned. So I think it is an opportunity for us to talk with these landowners and even just from an insurance and a risk point of view to communicate the importance of putting these kind of messages, which from the research we know, you know, swimming, boating, alcohol, supervision of children, cold water. I think we know what the messages would be. So it's about talking to those landowners and making sure we're incorporating that messaging into their safety information, their websites, their water safety plans, maybe even signage.
Yeah, it strikes me that the more we roll our sleeves up looking at issues with data and evidence, we find that there are so many different stakeholders involved in the problem and having a role in the solution. In an inland sense, you know, who are the key stakeholders that we need to do a better job of engaging in prevention efforts?
Yeah, so I mean, we've talked about the lakes there and the landowners. I think with rivers really is council, local council, and also the communities around these rivers. We also have sort of touched on national parks, so that's also a key landowner or a group that would be responsible for those environments and therefore the safety of people visiting those environments. So I think we do know the groups, but again, we keep coming back to this personal responsibility and behaviour change angle, and I think different communities will face different issues, particularly when we go rural. You know, one strategy and a particular strategy from the city is not going to work out in the country. So it almost is on a river by river or a town by town basis of working with people, talking about the issues specific to that area and what people in charge and even the community are willing and able to do about it and supporting them in doing that. And so, you know, Royal Life Saving's approach with community drowning prevention plans around inland waterways, I think it's really the right approach. Unfortunately, it's very time consuming and it can be a challenge, particularly when we move rurally and looking at distances to travel and small communities to reach. But I really do think it is the way forward for this kind of issue.
Right. Let's have a look at a video if we can, Will.
We want to show you what's dangerous about this river, but we can't. That's the problem. You can't see ice-cold water, snags like tree branches or strong currents. So in enjoying our rivers, remember, wear a life jacket, avoid alcohol around water, never swim alone, and learn how to save a life. Our rivers are beautiful, but more Australians drown here than anywhere else. It's simple. Respect the river. Head to royallifesaving.com.au/respect the river for more information.
I hadn't quite realised the significance of the galahs and the cockies in the background. It sort of conjures up this great. Oops, we've got another video. Yeah, it conjures up this great sort of image of the countryside. You were talking about messaging, and so they were. With like there was 4 or 5 key tips in that particular communication, but it was kind of overlaid with this idea that we couldn't show risks and hazards. Has that messaging changed as a consequence of the research you've been doing more recently, do you think?
No, I don't think so. I think we were still pretty much on the money there. I think there is still this underestimation of rivers as a risky location compared to a beach where, look, rips, very hard to spot. People think they can, but they really can't. You know, Rob's saying in the chat there, he dyes them to show people and now people think they're purple. So, you know, you've got that challenge to work with as well. But you don't, as we said in that advertisement, you can't see the hazards. And even the speed of the river can be quite deceptive. You really have to stand there. Talk about the think line. You have to stand there think about it and have a look for a while just to even see how fast the water is moving. So I still do think that we were on the right track there in terms of people underestimating the risk at rivers, and really half that battle was to say it is a leading location for drowning. Don't underestimate the risk. Much like the beach situation, it is not tourists, it's local people, and even more so for rivers than beaches. So I think it really is about, as we said in the program name, it really is about showing respect to that environment and recognizing that it might be more dangerous than it initially appears. And yeah, we really had that struggle for quite a while coming up with that, the visualizations for the advertisement. How do you show something you can't show? And I think some of the initial evaluation that we did on that showed that it was quite effective in getting that message across, at least making people realize that rivers are a risky location and that they need to be treated with respect. So yeah, I think we're on the right track, and I think we need some more evidence and more work in the evaluation space, which is where really we need to be moving as a drowning prevention community anyway.
Yeah, and Stacey Peden last week was talking about the challenges of making sure that those messages land in a diverse population. So, I think that was a point well made last week. I'd like to go to the next clip though, and let's get to alcohol, because this is your one of your favourite topics as well. Now, this is a moment of madness, Australia Day, I think, for women.
Probably about 6 or 8.
What we're doing here at the Murray, it being Australia Day today, we're actually surveying and breathalyzing river users.
And what have you guys been doing today?
Today,
Floating down the river.
and we've been drinking the whole time.
Keep going. Very good.
We floated down from Monaghan to here for Australia Day. Had a few drinks.
Did you go in the water?
This research is a partnership between James Cook Uni and Royal Lifesaving. And what we're aiming to do is go beyond, I guess, our understanding of the coronial data and try and get understanding of general river users' attitudes towards river safety, what they do at the river, and if they're drinking at the river as well.
If I have a few drinks, I usually chuck my jacket on my life jacket, and then I'll just float down. And
I don't think that alcohol is a good idea when swimming. I think it's best just to keep it at home.
Quite often we find that young people get in the river and they float from one point to another, and they take a lot of risks. And some of those risks include drinking and doing a lot of silly things like jumping off bridges and other obstacles. So we need to focus on safety around the river, but more specifically educating young people about the features of the river and the features they need to avoid.
So this is an example of, I guess it's the great Australian challenge. These people are, in their minds, having fun. And the two go together, river that day and a drink. So how are we going to go about changing these high-risk behaviours on those sort of cultural iconic days?
Yeah, it is. It really is a challenge. We saw that link in the drowning data, but we didn't really know what the picture was amongst those who don't end up in the coronial system. So we went out and breathalyzed people at a few different river locations in a couple of states, and it just happened to include the Murray River being the leading river drowning black spot in the country, but also that we coincided that trip with Australia Day. And what we saw really did validate, I guess, what we unfortunately see in the coronial system is we had much higher average blood alcohol readings when we were breathalyzing people there compared to other days on Australia Day. And you might have seen in one of the shots, there were police over my shoulder, I think, when I was being interviewed. So that was actually a designated alcohol-free zone where we were breathalyzing, which I thought was really going to mess up my data. It didn't, because nobody was aware of that and the police weren't enforcing it. And I really do think it's this cultural thing where it's just assumed that we should be allowed to drink, and we should be allowed to drink on Australia Day. And it's going to be bigger than just a river safety message or a drowning prevention message. This is all of us rethinking our relationship with alcohol and the risks we take and how much we drink. Because, yeah, some of the readings that we recorded on Australia Day were pretty staggering, and to think that they're being combined with aquatic activity in what we know to be a risky environment was very concerning.
Yeah, and we're not talking just a little bit of alcohol, we're talking a lot, and we're talking about drugs quite often as well as a factor. Oh.
Yes, sorry, thought I unmuted, but I didn't.
Wouldn't be Zoom without an unmute episode. Yeah.
I know, it had to happen once. There we go, I've done it. for everybody. Yes, so as you said, it's not just a couple of drinks. We had, from memory, I'm probably not going to get the numbers right, but I have seen that Alison has put a link to that paper. We saw average blood alcohol readings on Australia Day of 0.1, maybe 0.13. So if our legal upper driving limit's 0.05, that's approaching 3 times the limit. So that's a lot of alcohol being drunk. And I mean, we had a couple of people below 0.3, which is 6 times the legal limit on that day. So we had a lot of drinking happening, even when it was supposed to be a designated alcohol-free zone and police were watching people drink. So it was a lot of alcohol being consumed. And interestingly, the other surprising finding for us is that men make up 80% of river drowning statistics, even slightly higher when we look at river drownings with alcohol involvement. But we had equally high, if not higher, average blood alcohol readings amongst women at the river compared to men. So men are drinking and ending up drowning, but women are engaging in this high risk activity as well. So, you know, I think we're well within our rights to have a mates don't let their mates drink and drown, make the right call campaigns that focus on men, but we need to recognise that women are undertaking this kind of risky behaviour as well. And as you said, we often see in the coronial data that if someone is drinking, there's more likely to be a chance that illicit drugs have been consumed as well. And so if you think about that, that's double the risk of something going wrong when you're under the influence of a couple of different substances. So again, that's a whole nother level of understanding why people would take those risks. Do they even think it's a risk, and how we can communicate that it's really not the best idea.
Okay, thank you very much, Amy. I think we've covered the rivers and lakes section of the strategy really well. There's some links in the chat, so I'd encourage people to have a look at Amy's research. We're going to say goodbye to Amy, but we're going to bring Amy back a little bit downstream in the webinar. So thank you very much, Amy. I'd now like to move to Aquatic Facilities. We've got 2 wonderful speakers joining us at very short notice. I'd like to introduce Alexandra Ash. Alexandra Ash is from the YMCA, the Y, now rebranded, which is fantastic.
Yeah, the Y,
yeah. And we've got Cara Monaghan from Belgravia Leisure, the regional manager. So hello. So let's start with who you are and what keeps you interested in working in this wonderful space. Let's start with you, Alex.
Yeah, no worries. So as said, yeah, my name's Alex. I'm the Executive General Manager of Recreation at YVIC, which looks after over 70 facilities, and also the South Australian Aquatic and Leisure Centre, which is about to hold the trials as of this weekend, which is going to be showcased on Amazon Prime for those that are subscribers, which is pretty exciting. I've been with the Y for just over 12 years now through multiple different business units, but as I said, now head up the recreation space.
Great. And you, Cara?
Cara Monaghan. So my role is Regional Manager for Victoria and Tasmania for Belgravia Leisure. We've got about 200 sites across Australia, and in my portfolio, I have a mix of leisure centres, but also a hotel pool, Hepburn Bathhouse and Spa, and also a caravan park that has a pool attached. And prior to my role here, I worked in local government. So, and I've got 2 young kids. So this is a topic pretty close to my heart.
Fantastic. Thank you. Welcome. Alex, can I ask you just, have you contemplated the water safety strategy and the role that aquatic facilities sort of play in this overarching goal of reducing drowning?
Well, Justin, it's so relevant at the moment. Cara and I are both based in Melbourne, and unfortunately, our facilities are not open at the moment. And the staggering drowning rates in Victoria alone, over this last year, I think is something that needs to really be taken into consideration as Melbourne and Greater Victoria comes out of lockdown. The swimming lesson or an aquatic facility isn't just somewhere to have fun, but it is a very safe environment where we can teach children and adults alike, but most particular children, how to be safe around water and teach that fundamental life skill. And I think really from the WISE position, that's something that is going to have ongoing impacts into the future, and what even that looks like from this lockdown period, ability for us to provide that fundamental life skill.
Yeah, we should acknowledge that it's been a pretty torrid 12 months for industry across the country, but particularly in Victoria. So, Cara, so what do you think the impact of kids in Victoria missing out on swimming during that period will be? What can we do about it?
I think in terms of missing out on swimming, I think there's a few challenges there. I mean, I'm very lucky to be in regional Vic where I live at the moment. But what that means is if I'm not taking my kids to the pool, and we know that our swimming pools are statistically fairly safe environments, if I'm not taking my kids to the pool and I need to get them out and about and to do something, I'm going to a beach that may or may not be supervised, or I may choose to go to an area that isn't. So I think the impacts of venues being closed and not being able to run swimming lessons is profound. Secondly, we have the ability to educate people on key messages like, you know, supervising kids and swim with a buddy and all of those key messages that go across all of the multiple environments. And we're just not doing that while we're closed.
Right. Alex, what does, certainly both of you have pointed out that aquatic facilities are incredibly safe environments, but that sounds really simple. What sort of things do aquatic facilities do to ensure their safety?
Oh, multiple things. You know, we could go to the transactional hygiene factors of signage and lifeguards and those sort of things. But you know, I can provide just one really clear example that I know that we did in the city of Greater Dandenong, which is a cold aquatic program, which provided in-kind swimming lessons to refugee miners in the community, Dandenong being the highest multicultural community in Australia, and you know, how bodies of water provided needed to be safe for that cohort. And so what we did was provide those swimming lessons opportunities to then turn into economic benefit opportunities of employment for these young people. So imagine, you know, a person that came over as a refugee miner came and learned how to swim with the wire in one of these, you know, fantastic aquatic facilities, and now is a nurse at Alfred Hospital looking after and our COVID patients and what that looks like. And I think it's those those stories that is more than just the signage in an aquatic centre or the lifeguard that, you know, helps make sure the place is safe. It's the larger economic benefit and mental health benefit that comes from aquatic facilities.
Yeah, we've been working on this notion of the health, social, economic benefits of aquatic industries, because we're passionate about more of them. We'd love them to be open, but we'd certainly like more of them, particularly in regional areas. Cara, you mentioned that you're in regional Victoria. Are there pool shortages, pool gaps in those areas? Is that something we could be working on? I think it's signalled in the water safety strategy that we need more pools simply.
There's definitely gaps, and not only is there gaps as you know, people move out and our population increases, but also we've got a whole range of facilities that were built after the boom that are coming to end of life that need some love and attention and are falling apart, and there needs to be something to, you know, done in that space as well. So absolutely, yep.
Yeah, I think to Alex's point, I think if we can make a stronger and more diverse case in terms of the contribution that these facilities make, particularly in regional communities, but also some of the outer suburbs, I think are desperate for opportunities, whether it's sort of employment or other health benefits. Cara, you mentioned that you have responsibility for caravan park pools and hotel pools. Is there do you go about this differently between the two types of venues?
Yeah, it's really interesting, and even, you know, when you've got the dot points up there around risk assessments and training and standardised data collection and supervision of kids, you know, the GSPOs talk to those points, and I think the aquatic industry as it relates to, you know, council facilities or public leisure centres is implemented fairly well. I think when it comes to things like committees of management, the hotel industry, even spas, the documentation and the same principles, it's not widely known. The same key messages definitely get lost. You know, in terms of Belgravia Leisure, we've got very you know, standardized training tools that we implement right across all the venues. But certainly when I network with those other areas like hotels, it's a place, it's an area that really doesn't get much attention and isn't valued particularly highly.
Yeah, I think we've certainly got a lot of work to do in those locations. And when you look at some of the drowning data that gets analysed through some of the hotel pools, particularly when we've got massive amounts of international tourists coming through, there's a sort of a regular pattern there. And of course, occasionally, unfortunately, we've had some incidents in caravan parks more recently. Alex, I do a lot of work with Melinda Kroll, the YMCA national CEO, and she's a fantastic advocate for the power of the Y at a community level. Are there other areas that the Y can make contributions to the water safety strategy that we haven't discussed yet?
Oh, I think most definitely. Like at the Y, we have our ELCs, our OSHAs. We have a holistic view of community connection that builds thriving communities. Right, it's not just a swimming lesson. It's not just a kid getting healthy on an RPM bike or anything like that. It's a holistic view of thriving communities. And so that's where we really love like co-located opportunities, precinct opportunities, but even just holistic connections of maternal child health and things like that. So, and also, we have a program called Rebuild, which is the Youth Recidivism program, which teaches young offenders trades, and then how do we use that in facility maintenance, for instance. Like there's a holistic view there. But I think the other point is that, and Cara mentioned it before about her experience with caravan parks and hotels. It's also, if we look at these beautiful brand new sparse facilities, such as we have these huge glass areas and the roof looks amazing, but operationally and safety wise, how do these facilities operate? And I think that's one thing in terms of us as an advocacy body, like working together in advocacy wise in terms of local governments or in federal government and state as well, is operationally how safe are these beautiful facilities. But an example of a child having to enter a facility and the first body of water that they see is a 2 metre deep, 50 metre pool. Extraordinary when we look at those sort of things. So I think that's a big area in terms of ensuring all venues conduct and implement regular risk assessments as one of the key activities. How do we get in at the front end to really provide operational expertise to make these facilities beautiful and usable and safe?
Yeah, look, that's a really great point to end this section on. I'd like to thank you, Alex. It's been fantastic to have you, and Cara. I wish you all the best with the rest of your day. Alex, you've got a hot cup of coffee there by the looks of that.
I know, my husband walks in with a cup of coffee. I'm like, I'm live, mate. No, it's all good.
Well, you can. I'm sure you'll have a laugh about that a little bit later. But thank you to you both. It's been wonderful having you. Thank you.
No, thank you so much, Justin. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thanks, Cara. All the best. All right, so now we might move from places into activities. That was I thought actually the whole session, it's a good deal of time though. We spent an hour on places, and now we've got about half an hour to deal with some pretty important activities. So let's start by introducing Vanessa Spark and also Neil Moody. Welcome, Vanessa. You're from Maritime Safety Victoria. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Justin. No, thanks for inviting us along to speak today. To give you a bit of background of who I am, I'm a boater safety education officer in an extremely passionate recreational boating team. Maritime Safety Victoria often gets confused because we often turn up in a Transport Safety Victoria car and we're branded that way. So Maritime is part of Transport Safety Victoria. So we're basically the regulators of all Victorian waterways, and there are over 600 waterways across Victoria. So there's inland waters, enclosed waters, which is our bay, and coastal waters. And I know Dr. Peden mentioned the Murray River. The Murray River is actually New South Wales waters, so that doesn't come in our statistics.
Yeah, look, that's been a long-running debate and a challenge from a prevention perspective. I'm going to come back to you, Vanessa, because I've got a few questions, but let me introduce Neil Moody from the Bureau of Meteorology. Thanks for joining us, Neil.
Thank you, Justin.
Just a little bit about your background.
Yeah. My role is looking after the Bureau's marine weather services. That entails the essentially the boating sort of style forecasts about winds and waves on the coastlines, and also some of our local waters, sort of capital city harbours and lakes. So we have a strong focus on some of the warning products as well we provide in terms of wind warnings, targeted at boaters, as well as the wave warnings that are targeted at some of the rock fishers, which I know we'll talk about later. Equally, the second part of that wave warning is also focused on boats crossing ocean bars. So that's an important sort of aspect. So thank you.
Thanks for joining us, because it must be a pretty significant day in weather terms, given that there's some pretty significant weather across Victoria and it's snowing, all up and down the Great Dividing Range. So thank you. Vanessa, I just wonder whether we underestimate the contribution that government makes through the transport portfolio. And so the maritime safety plans that are in existence or around the country, most state governments have a really good investment in this area. Can you kind of talk to those investments and the key areas of the maritime safety plans across the country, or more specifically from Victoria's take?
Yeah, look, our basically is to promote shaping safer journeys across Victoria, and to deliver community education programs to promote safe boating. And basically our aim is that every boater on any water should return home safely from being a day out on the water and achieve zero fatalities.
And do you have in Victoria sort of life jacket campaigns and programs? Because that's one of the things that the water safety strategy calls for.
Yeah, just recently we ran a float safe campaign across 9 locations in Victoria. And that was basically to get people to maintain and service their life jackets, which has been a highly successful program.
And Neil, one of the other areas of the strategy in this area is greater partnership with the Bureau and getting weather messages out. How are you going about doing that?
Yeah, no, it's an important aspect, because ideally we'd love to get higher connection with some of the weather data, which is presented in some of the values, and then having a response by the sort of target audience. So that would be the ultimate sort of game. So to have that connection, you've obviously got to work with the partners and sort of establish that linkage and get that last mile communication going down to that sort of target audience, whether it's on the rock platforms or at the beach interface or on the boats themselves. So yeah, we've got a number of initiatives that we've been working with different partner agencies around the marine safety agencies and surf life savings groups, and looking at sort of the data and matching up how we can sort of link the incidents and the environmental conditions surrounding those, and then look at ways we could look at that from a presentation of information, and also potentially thresholds for actual public warnings. So yeah, it's we've already got some established mechanisms in New South Wales, for example, with the rock fishing and the boat hazardous surf warning. But other jurisdictions, I'm sure we can have the same sort of pattern and work through that.
Vanessa, I think there's some questions in the chat prior, just about the use of data in planning from a Victorian perspective. What's the evaluation agenda? What's the data role in planning your activities, or is there one?
There is incident reports come through, mainly focusing on our fatalities. There's been 10 fatalities in both the last 2 years. A lot of the other data that we get is about breakdown of boats, about rescues, about people overboard. And then sadly, a lot of the data we actually, incidental data, say about severe injuries that occur, they sometimes don't get reported. And it's very difficult to get that information out of the hospitals of how many minor or major injuries occur and through the ambulances. So the data that we rely heavily on, sadly, are the fatalities that occur that do have an impact on, that drive our campaigns for the coming year.
And I've lost my script, but I think we had a video in this session that we were going to use, and someone's going to madly shake their head at me if we didn't. Here we go.
A compliance crackdown on our waterways.
It's been stopping your safety checks and breath tests for today.
Police out in force for a statewide summer safety blitz.
1, 2, 3, 4.
These boats free to go, but others handed hefty fines during this weekend's high visibility Operation Armada.
Oh, sorry, didn't know that.
More than 100 officers across the state targeting dangerous behaviour and testing for not so sober skippers.
Can you just blow like you're blowing a balloon?
Thankfully, no positive tests were returned, but 60 infringement notices were issued, mostly for speeding, not having the right safety equipment and failing to wear a life jacket.
We know this is going to be a very busy summer across our waterways. Licence applications are up. Purchase of stand-up paddle boards, jet skis. You can't buy jet skis until October next year.
While this operation ends tonight, police say their blitz on bad boating behaviour will continue throughout the summer, targeting vessels big and small and promising a zero-tolerance approach.
You will be booked or you will be arrested and charged with those offences.
Amber Laidler, 7 News.
Vanessa, so you've talked about sort of education. Does enforcement play a role in the Victorian approach as well?
Yes, we do. We do have an enforcement and compliance team, and we also work very closely with Victorian Police, and the Victorian Police work on our behalf, the Waterway Police based in Gippsland and in Melbourne, to ensure and enforce the regulations here on our waterways. We also work very closely with the Victorian Fishing Authority here and also Parks Victoria and also many local councils. And by working with them, they also operate as compliance and as education officers to regulate and educate our community. So we do have enormous amounts of engagement with lots of organisations throughout Victoria, such as Parks Victoria, as I've said, the Water Police, the Fisheries. Local councils also send our messages through their own authorised officers too. And we also work with the volunteer communities such as the Coast Guard and also Victorian Marine and Rescue. And it's really, really helpful that, yes, we have a compliance component, but at Maritime, we believe also education is at the forefront of getting people to change their behaviour, not just relying on getting a ticket at the end of the day. And that's one great thing about our compliance team is they also do a lot of education as well. And same with fisheries, they really support us in sending the boating safety education messages too, because many of our people that are on boats do come from the fishing community. And we also, in that respect, we work very closely with a lot of the fishing clubs in Victoria. We host seminars and we also make lots of visits to regional shows and lots of different events. So at Maritime, sorry if I'm going on a bit, Justin, but at Maritime, we really spread ourselves across the community and agencies in so many different ways. As just recently we've discovered, we've done this, as I mentioned earlier, a float safe campaign of teaching people how to maintain and service their life jackets, as we've discovered in the last several years that people aren't maintaining their inflatable life jackets. So yes, they have their life jacket on, but when they go to pop the life jacket, it doesn't work. So, sorry, getting to my other point. So after completing all these amazing campaigns it was extremely successful across regional and metropolitan Victoria. The thing that when we did our evaluation at the end, what we discovered, it was face-to-face education over a period of time that is having an enormous impact of us getting our messages out there to the community. And the fact that, you know, the local council would come along, fisheries would come along as we delivered our messages, it was one big face delivering the same consistent messages. And it's been wonderful to the point, you know, the councils are saying, can you please come back and continue this program next year? But the really key thing, I think the points that I'm trying to get to, it's face-to-face has proven to be our most successful way to get people to be safe on the water. Thanks, Justin.
Great, thanks very much, Vanessa. I think you're really speaking to the complexity of bringing stakeholders together. You've listed off many. Amy was also talking about this in sort of a multi-sectoral coordinated response. But Liz, I should acknowledge that that you're one very strong voice from a network across the country of people doing similar and wonderful things in many other states. And ANZBEG is one of the groups that coordinates for that cohort of people that contribute to the Australian Water Safety Strategy. Vanessa, I'd like to say goodbye and thank you very much for joining us. We're going to move on to rock fishing now. So thank you very much. Have a great day. And I'd like to introduce Peter Campster, Dr. Peter Campster, actually, a researcher of note, but particularly we want to talk to Peter about his work in this area of rock fishing. So welcome, Peter.
Yeah, thanks, Justin.
You literally got a phone call at 9 o'clock this morning to join us. So thanks for your agility and availability. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, no worries. My pleasure.
Great. And we've got Shane back. What I'd like to do, actually, I think the best thing to do here would be just to show a clip to give the audience a little bit of a sense of this rock fishing issue that we need to respond to. So if we could just play the video and then we'll get started with some discussion.
Wrapped in a blanket, the only survivor of a sunset fishing trip. Emergency crews sprung to action just before 7 o'clock last night after the 3 men were swept off the rocky outcrop known as Hill 60 at Port Kembla, south of Sydney. A tragedy all too familiar.
Only recently, on the 22nd of January, we lost another 3 people in exactly the same area.
This highway patrol officer, the first on scene, diving into the danger, clutching onto Mahedi Khan from Lakemba, the 30-year-old unconscious. Then 100 metres offshore, coming to the aid of his 42-year-old friend from Wiley Park.
By that time, could only see like this bobbing.
More than a dozen surf lifesavers rushing in, none of the men believed to have been wearing life jackets. At the same time, the toll rescue chopper winching their mate, 37-year-old Muzaffar Ahmed, also from Western Sydney. Quick thinking crew, sparing not a second.
Is he going to land there?
Our medics proceed to work on the male. Unfortunately, we were unable to revive him.
Another 2 officers throwing their bodies on the line during the operation. The pounding swell knocking them off their feet, causing minor injuries. There are warning signs here about the dangerous rock platform, but after 5 deaths in just 3 weeks, authorities admit the message isn't getting through, particularly to fishermen who aren't familiar with the area.
Some nights there's like 60 fishermen down there and they can stay there until 2 or 3 in the morning in the pitch black. You know, you just see it lit up like a Christmas tree.
If you intend to go rock fishing in conditions that are deemed dangerous without the personal protective gear, then that is the risk that you take personally.
It's just your own common sense to save your own life.
Hayley Francis, 9 News.
So that was an incredibly tragic set of events, and certainly that video, that news clip, kind of encapsulates all of the challenges. Let me start with you, Peter. From a research perspective, what do we need to do to improve these circumstances?
Yeah, well, it is a tough one just because of the variety of different people using the platforms and the variety of different sites that each of them present their own specific risks on specific days. So in partnership with Surf Lifesaving, I have spent a few years down on the platforms with rock fishers themselves, and we've sort of been studying their behaviors and the perceptions between the really experienced fishers and the inexperienced fishers. So I would say the advice that I've been given by the most experienced fishers is to really try to help people understand that each specific platform is dangerous in its own ways on specific days. And they've even said that they've had to fish 10 years at one spot just to learn the risks on different days during different conditions. So I think that's one important message. And the second thing that they emphasized, we actually had a publication on this with Shane, is the idea of freak waves and the importance of understanding what a wave period is. Just sort of looking at, I'm not sure if, I know some of the messages from Neil and the BOM too communicates the importance of understanding wave period, but just understanding that on particular days when the wave period is quite long, it can look calm for long periods of time, but there are eventually larger waves that are going to come over. And that potentially is something else we can communicate to people, the importance of looking at the wave period, not just looking at the size of the swell on a particular day for people to make a risk assessment.
Neil, it seems to me that forecasting plays a significant role here.
Yeah, that's true. I think it's giving enough sort of localized detail as well as sort of simple messaging around those kind of wave conditions that are going to present that in enhanced risk, essentially. Because as Peter said, it's the wave energy sort of has that sort of impact on the rock platform or interaction with the rocks that it might be different for different sort of wave heights. So that's a bit of a variable that's not fully apparent, and that's essentially what sort of spurred on the hazardous surf warning in New South Wales to at least address that aspect when there is that high energy swell that might be pushing a lot more onto the rocks, and especially with the different tides as well. So we try to have built up that sort of checking the weather before you go rock fishing to encapsulate that sort of wave, tide, and sort of warning kind of functionality. So yeah, it's I'd love to see the rock fishing sort of community get a lot more sort of let's say aware of being able to check the weather and then knowing what to look for. And so that's that sort of bridge that we've got to fill between the sort of education and the services we provide.
Yeah, a few weeks ago, personal stories, so warning. I nearly drowned while surfing, and it was one of those days where the surf was pumping, and like I'd been hanging on your advice for days, knowing that this particular Saturday was going to be really a great day of surfing. But at a barbecue the following week, a friend of mine, 60-year-old, born overseas, been in Australia probably 30 years or so. I know he doesn't swim very well, and I'd lectured him about this Port Kembla example for a month prior. On that day, he drove 2 hours up to Fraser Park, like one of Shane's black spots in terms of drowning events. Totally missed the communication on weather warnings and the like. So I'm quite staggered. But Peter, if you've spent lots of time on these rock shelves, how do we get those weather warning messages to this sort of cohort of not just expert fisher folk, but actually casual fisher folk, the people that sort of on the spur of the moment decide to go fishing with their mates once or twice a year?
Yeah, well, again, it's a difficult thing because people use so many different weather apps to do it. But I think one thing that is encouraging is one of the questions that we asked the fishers is, did you check the conditions before you came? And every single person said yes. So I think people are checking the conditions across different apps, but I think trying to have maybe one central focus to sort of say, if you're fishing, don't use Willy Weather, don't use SwellNet, don't use the BOM, just use the BOM, for example, because then there's a bit more of a consistent message. Because some of these sites are so unique in their conditions, the conditions can vary a little bit depending on some of the apps. I know some of the fishers showed me on their phones, right, the conditions varied slightly. So I think having one specific app would be really helpful, one specific warning system, and also just communicating to inexperienced fishers in particular who said they just look at the swell height. If it's under 1.2 meters, it's safe to fish. And again, that's not necessarily the case, depending on the swell direction, the wave period, and other conditions that Neil described. So I think those would be the two ways. People are accessing apps, which is great. So they're looking, just understanding what specific things to look for at specific spots.
Thank you. And I know someone's just posted some links to some of your research, including a freak wave publication. So thanks for that work. It's greatly appreciated. Shane, can I ask you, just bring you into the conversation? There's been some real great success in a number of states, particularly in some councils in New South Wales. But overnight, there's a little bit of media about a change to the New South Wales rock fishing law, which mandates life jacket use And so one of the things that's being talked about, and it's early days, is this choice between wearing a life jacket versus wearing a wetsuit. Where do you think that's going to land in terms of the preventing rock fishing drowning?
Yeah, thanks, Justin. It's a very interesting one. I know there's a lot of debate out there about buoyancy and looking after yourself. Probably from my perspective, it'll require a little bit more investigation and work into it, because the wetsuit, as you know from a surfing element, is designed to provide you some personal protection, but not really for buoyancy in that sense. There's no doubt that if you get some of the thicker wetsuits, you get up at 5 mil, 7 mil, you will get some buoyancy out of there, but it's not going to be the level of a life jacket. And we know that the work that we've done with low buoyancy life jackets for our own surf sports activity, which are approved under the Australian standards, will that support you? Which have 25 newtons, so the standard life jacket's 50 newtons, so you're going half that. Low buoyancy life jacket isn't designed to float you above the surface so that you can breathe, etc. It's to bring you near to the surface so you can be recovered or rescued if you're unconscious, so that you're not floating away. So for a wetsuit, we know with the number of people who have gone out either snorkeling, diving, or in other activities with wetsuits, forget that they may have if they don't have weight belts on, if they're there, generally you're still going to initially sink. So you got to have a pretty thick wetsuit. So I applaud the idea that talking about increasing their safety, but I think there needs to be a bit more robust discussion around what that safety means, and some testing needs to look at, what are you actually trying to achieve here? If you're trying to achieve buoyancy within that sort of environment, then maybe better off looking at a low buoyancy life jacket than something which is going to be potentially may keep them a little bit warmer, but isn't going to give the buoyancy. And when you are, as Pete and I know we've discussed with different people, when a rock fisher is washed off a rock ledge, we know that they've told us previously that they believe they can survive in the water for around 7 to 10 minutes till help arrives. But when you question that further, you've got to come into play, well, how did you end up in the water in the first place? And also, how do you know that you can survive? And they say, well, in my pool, I can get in my pool and float for 5 to 10 minutes, 15 minutes quite easily. So in the ocean, I should be able to do it. But they're forgetting the fact that most of the times, and Pete did a lot of work, when people are washed off rock ledges, we're talking 5 meters, 10 meters, up to 20 meters being washed off rock ledges. So you've got that fall, you've got that impact, you're in a swash zone and in a hostile environment. It's pretty difficult to survive. So the life jacket is going to give you that greatest chance of survival. It's not a 100% guarantee, but we know that we've recovered more people successfully with life jackets than without.
Yeah, it strikes me that we're back in that RIP discussion of looking for a simple solution in a complex environment with a complex range of factors. Listen, I'd like to thank you, Shane, and I'd like to thank you, Peter and Neil. I would say that actually this strikes me as something that we can't do credit to in 10 minutes. So I do apologise for dancing through the strategy and touching on each of these areas. I would encourage anyone on the webinar that wants to read a little bit more about this. A simple Google of rock fishing New South Wales will find some really interesting thing. Randwick Council, I think, has some really great stuff on their website. Surf Lifesaving has some good rock fishing information as well. And then also look up Peter's the links that someone's put into that based on his research. There are some other research available in this area. And so thank you, Neil, as well, for giving us that glimpse of the Bureau and the role the Bureau is increasingly playing in this space. So thank you very much to everyone. We're going to move on and talk about diving and snorkeling now. Thank you very much. All right, so next, and we're running a little bit over time, that's my mistake, but the person with the greatest backdrop here, Dr. John Lippmann, OAM. Welcome, John.
Hello, Justin. How are you?
Good,
Hi,
thank you. And Amy's coming back to join us. So thank you very much for your patience. I'm getting all of these text messages from Monique Sharp saying you're over time, quick, you've got to get to John Lippmann. So we're glad to have you. So this area, this is sort of one of these wonderful parts of Australia. The snorkeling and diving is such a wonderful thing to do, and your backdrop is a testament to that, of course. But in terms of reducing drowning, preventing drowning in this space, what are the key parts that you advocated into the Australian Water Safety Strategy?
Oh, the main parts were, I think, the medical assessment of older divers is really important, because we're finding that at least 25% of the deaths these days, the diving and the snorkeling fatalities, are cardiac related, right? So it's an older cohort of people participating, often, certainly in scuba diving and also in snorkeling in certain areas, and they're coming with cardiac baggage. So the medical assessment is really important, and it's underplayed. It used to be required that anyone doing a scuba course had to go through a full diving medical assessment. That's not the case now. There's a questionnaire, and if people tick certain boxes on the questionnaire, they then need to go and have an assessment. And then you've got the issues of who does the assessment and what knowledge does that doctor have about the aquatic and especially the underwater environment, and that comes into play. Other key areas are who's accompanying you when you're going diving, and there's a buddy system in diving and snorkeling where you should be with a person that stays close with you, keeps a good eye on you, and you're doing the same with them, so that if something does go wrong, there's somebody at hand that can react really quickly. And a huge percentage of scuba divers, about 80%, well, not 80%, but over 50%, I think, were found not to have buddies at the time of their demise, and the same happens with snorkeling. So a lot of people just like to do it alone, or separate, or start off with a buddy and then get engrossed in their own activity. But they need to keep in mind that if something goes wrong, if it hits the fan, you want somebody there. Inexperience is an issue. People having a break from diving or snorkeling and then coming back to it and thinking they're as good as they once were, or never being that good in the first place. Inexperience, skill, lack of skill attainment, or still skill degradation if they haven't been in for a while is an issue. So there's a whole bunch of things. And one that actually I thought, I was thinking about when you were talking about the rock fishing with the inflatable life jackets, is buoyancy. A lot of divers, in fact 80% of scuba divers, are found with their weights on. So they actually have to be searched for, found underwater, brought to the surface, brought on board a platform, and managed for resuscitation. And divers don't do it very well, getting that positive buoyancy. So, you know, what we try and teach and try and embed as a safety message is that if somebody gets into trouble underwater, if they think they're going to go unconscious, they need to get positively buoyant. And you can do that by ditching your weight belt or inflating your buoyancy jacket. And a huge number of people just don't do that. And it's got to be sort of an embedded skill. And if somebody's tied up in the, you know, the mind-numbing inertia of a diving emergency or an emergency, they don't always react right and automatically go and get themselves positively buoyant. And just going back to your rock fishing people and even on boats with inflatable life jackets, that's one thing that I think will be interesting to watch in the future. In what circumstances do people actually inflate their jackets?
Yeah, John, so you talk about cardiac baggage and dropping a weight belt and inflating a buoyancy jacket. These are all sort of individual responses. Are there any system-wide responses that we can use to prevent drowning in or scuba incidents?
Well, education. So we need to educate the general community that might go diving and snorkeling or think about it, about health issues, about safety issues, about conditions, about weather, about not going beyond their capabilities. We need to educate the organisations involved in diving and keep them aware of what's happening with accidents and the type of precipitants, so that they can incorporate that in their organisational management, in their training programs. We need to keep government informed about what's going on in this sphere, how significant a problem it is. And in different places, they see it as a different level of importance. For instance, in Queensland, where diving tourism is a fairly big market, they take it a lot more seriously, and they have a regulated code of practice there to try and make the diving, standardise it more in a safety aspect, which isn't the case in pretty much every other jurisdiction. So government has a role to play depending on the level of morbidity and mortality in that area and what they think about it.
Thanks, John. Amy, you, John, and actually lead author, I think, was Cody from Canada. Cody Dunn or Cody Doon? I'm not sure. I've been saying Dunn and someone said Doon this morning. So Cody, Canadian researcher. Can you clarify his surname? And Cody, if you're online, call it out. But what was that research about? As a scoping review, and what did it tell us about preventing drowning in this area?
Yeah, so first things first, I can't clarify his surname. I've collaborated with him a few times, chat on WhatsApp all the time, so I'll take that down for further action. But yes, Cody led us in a literature review. We had some discussion about snorkeling and scuba diving related drowning, and realised actually we needed to look at the state of the science first of all. So Cody led us in a literature review, and what we found is that outside of Australia, actually, there is very little data looking at this issue. So first of all, I would encourage anyone around the world with this kind of data to hand to publish it or make it available. And we did look at grey literature as well. So not just in the academic space, but just making this data available. So yeah, we really, first of all, as researchers tend to do, called for more data and more research. But we did make a number of recommendations, including some of the things that John has mentioned. So really some of the key things were those medical conditions, the buddy system, also touching on the tourism perspective as well. And as John has mentioned, Queensland is really leading the way in that sense with codes of practice, and in talking about a systems approach, that's probably something that we could encourage other jurisdictions to improve. But we also just had a wide range of activities that people were doing, I guess, when they were snorkeling. So we have the recreational element, might be locals, might be tourists, but we also have the fishing for survival and sustenance for food, and cultural practices with fishing. And then we also have the occupational element as well. So it's quite a diverse field where, Australia is leading the way in terms of the evidence, but there is a lot more we need to learn and a lot more we can do regarding prevention.
Sure, John, put your hand up.
Yeah. One of the interesting things too, we're talking about the cardiac issue with snorkeling, for instance, and that's a big issue in Queensland, where you get a lot of older tourists coming in there with snorkeling on the barrier reef on their bucket list. And so we get a fair incidence of cardiac issue there. Whereas in other parts of Australia, it's more young, active, experienced spearfisher men mainly, who drown primarily, and often because they're extended breath holding. So they get what I call breath holding blackout, where they're sort of extending their breath holding, going down quite deep for quite a long time, and black out before they come to the surface or shortly after surfacing. And if they don't have a very vigilant buddy there to grab them, get their head out of the water and manage them, they often drown. So that's a big issue. And the other thing in New Zealand is I've just done a series of snorkel fatalities and scuba fatalities in New Zealand. And it's a big issue there with seafood hunting, and especially in the Maori community. And the skills aren't necessarily there. The equipment isn't necessarily there. A lot of people go spearing in bad conditions or power collecting in bad conditions without fins on, for instance. So, it varies in different communities. And just let me say one thing about the cardiac issue going into snorkeling and scuba. A lot of people just put it down to the cardiac stress due to exertion of being in the water, but it's a lot more than that. As soon as you become immersed, whether you're scuba diving, snorkeling, swimming, you get a redistribution of blood from your legs, for instance, and a fair bit from your arms into your chest. And that can be up to 700 mil. And your heart, when it pumps, has to push that away. So you're putting a greater stress on the heart. It has to work harder straight away as soon as you're immersed. And when you add to that wearing a wetsuit, wearing other equipment, dragging it around, swimming against currents, aspirating salt water, all those are triggers for a cardiac event. So you've got a toxic mix there, a witch's brew that can potentially cause problems in a susceptible person. And most of the people that we deal with, that I'm examining as fatalities, don't know that they're necessarily susceptible people. They've got occult disease. And that's, again, why we encourage people to go and get medically examined.
Another topic where we could spend a good hour on, no doubt, but witch's brew has made a whole heap of people on this webinar hungry for their lunch. So we're gonna wrap the session up now. I'd like to thank you, John, for joining us, and Amy, of course, for joining us throughout the webinar. There's a couple of links in the sidebar to various bits of research and the network. So thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, John. Thank you, Amy.
See you, Amy. See you, Justin.
Well, that was a pretty rapid hour and 36 minutes. I do apologise for going over time. It's been a fantastic session. We've added a few more speakers today just to see whether that would work for you all. A massive dump of information, some really great information there. But again, I do think that we could have spent hours just on some of those topics alone. I'd like to just do a plug for the webinar next week on Thursday, the 17th of June. We're going to have a look at some of the bigger challenges and opportunities. We might have a look at what's going on regionally and also try and bring that into some local action. We've got 2 speakers at the moment, but there's many more to come and a few ideas, so look out for that. Plug the webinar to your friends as well. I think we got to about 85 people today, which was pretty impressive. Once again, I'd like to thank those people behind the scenes making the webinar successful. Alison, Monique, Chris, and also Will have been in the background helping us with the technology and also the program. So I thank them for their contribution. I thank you all for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Have a great day. Thank you.